Hello everyone, the long-awaited patch of the Pyro Archon has finally arrived, and even though HOYOMiX still hasn't released any drip marketing yet for anyone, we do have the beta kit information from Mavuika. As an Archon, she has very high expectations for her abilities and strength in the meta, and there is already plenty of discourse whether or not she's good or bad. For Mavuika specifically, most people were expecting either a Xiangling replacement or a top tier main DPS, and after analyzing her kit, I do think she manages to meet both of these expectations, though with some caveats. So let's get right into the details of her initial beta kit. As always, remember that this is very early information, so very subject to change. Mavuika is a 5-star Pyro Claymore user that ascends with crit damage. One key thing to note about her base stats is that she has 359 base attack, the new highest in the game. She has the ability to play like either an off-field sub DPS applying Pyro or as an on-field Pyro main DPS, and both of these playstyles are looking meta viable. These two forms are outlined in her elemental skill. When Mavuika uses her skill, she deals damage, generates 5 particles, and enters Night Soul's Blessing with 80 Night Soul points. If you press her skill to activate it, she spawns a ring that follows the active character. This ring will target a nearby enemy and hit all enemies within the range every 2 seconds, so it has a relatively big AoE. These hits don't have any elemental ICD. As I'm making this video, we currently don't know how many attacks can happen per skill, but with a skill cooldown of 15 seconds, I think it's safe to assume that she has at least close to full uptime. This serves as Mavuika's off-field pyro damage and application, and for many teams, this application is enough. If you hold Mavuika's skill to use it instead, however, she hops on her motorcycle. Exploration-wise, while on her motorcycle, Mavuika can move like Malani, Xiangling, and Chaska combined. Combat-wise, all of Mavuika's attacks are enhanced while on her motorcycle. Even a dash will deal damage during this state. This serves as Mavuika's way of being a main DPS. While in either form, you can press skill again to swap between the two. Next, Mavuika's Elemental Burst contains a new mechanic that we haven't seen in Genshin. It has an 18-second cooldown, but it doesn't require energy to use. In a similar way to how Acheron and Fei Xiao charged their ultimates differently in Honkai Star Rail, Mavuika charges her Elemental Burst via Fighting Spirit, which can be obtained in 2 different ways. Whenever Night Soul points are consumed by any party member, they get converted into Fighting Spirit. In addition, each normal attack that hits an enemy gives 1.5 Fighting Spirit. Mavuika needs a minimum of 100 Fighting Spirit to use her burst, and she can hold up to 200. Once it is used, it does a huge nuke of AoE damage and makes Mavuika get on her motorcycle. In addition, with her A4 passive, using her burst will give a decaying damage bonus buff to the active character depending on how much Fighting Spirit was consumed when using her burst. At max Fighting Spirit, this is a 50% damage bonus to the active character that slowly decays. Lastly, Mavuika gains 10 Night Soul points and enters Crucible of Life and Death for 7 seconds. This is a special state that gives Mavuika resistance to interruption, allows her on-field motorcycle attacks to not consume any Night Soul points, and enhances the damage of all of these attacks based on the amount of Fighting Spirit that was consumed when using her burst. For instance, at max stacks, each of her charged attacks will go from having around a 500% multiplier to around an 800% multiplier within the 7-second window. Thus, getting as many stacks as possible before using Mavuika's burst will be important for her performance, especially as a main DPS, and the easiest way is through other teammates consuming Night Soul points, so Mavuika really likes playing with other natlan characters. Lastly, Mavuika's A1 passive gives her 35% attack for 10 seconds whenever Night Soul burst is triggered, and her exploration passives are the typical Night Soul transmission stuff, with Night Soul transmission getting a 20% cooldown reduction. That's everything on Mavuika's base kit. In terms of talent priority, you'll want to level both skill and burst equally, though you can prioritize her burst a bit more when considering Mavuika in her off-field playstyle. When playing Mavuika just for her off-field pyro application, all you do is tap her skill and burst whenever you have it to get her damage buff, then swap out. Most of the time, you'll just ignore the on-field buff that she gets. Now, as an on-field DPS, you'll want to first set up all your support skills, ideally with some natlan supports, and gain as much Fighting Spirit as possible, assuming that you don't have her burst up yet. Then use Mavuika's skill into burst, then start whacking the enemies with her motorcycle for the 7-second period where her attacks are empowered and don't consume any Night Soul points. The current assumption is that 7 charge attacks is the best, but other combos may be better, and some teams might want normal attacks more. After her 7-second empowered state is over, you can swap back to your supports to hopefully recharge her Fighting Spirit. Reminder that Mavuika herself can generate at least 80 Fighting Spirit through her own off-field damage. Next, let's cover Mavuika's beta constellations. C1 increases Mavuika's maximum Night Soul points to 120, allows Fighting Spirit to be generated more quickly, and gives her 40% attack after she gains any Fighting Spirit. Very strong attack buff, as well as increasing the duration of her off-field capabilities and effectively giving Mavuika better burst uptime. Her C2 is quite overloaded. While in Night Soul, Mavuika gets 300 base attack. And let's just stop there for a second. This isn't 300 attack, it's 300 base attack, and increasing this means all of her attack buffs give her even more attack as well. With C2, she can get to over 4,000 attack, which is pretty insane. But on top of that, C2 gives Mavuika 20% defense shred while off field and increased normal and charged attack bonus based on her attack. Definitely one of the strongest C2s in the game so far. C3 increases her burst talent level by 3, C4 makes her A4 damage bonus buff to the active character no longer decay over time. C5 increases her skill talent level by 3, and lastly, C6 gives her off-field form attacks an additional hit of damage, and while she's in the on-field DPS form, Mavuika now gets a form of off-field damage as well. Additionally, her exploration movement gets both enhanced and an increased duration. Next, let's go over Mavuika's potential build options. Weapons are the same for both off-field and on-field playstyles. Mavuika's signature is a very high base attack weapon with crit rate substat. With his special passive, after using skill or burst, the wearer gets 20% crit damage and 28% attack for 6 seconds. You can extend this duration when normal attacks and charged attacks deal elemental damage, but if the wearer is in Night Soul's Blessing, these stats are increased by 75% and their durations don't tick down while off-field. Thus, for Mavuika, this is just 35% crit damage and 49% attack, so it's very strong. Other potential 5-star weapons you can use as stat 6 include Beacon, Kenichi's Signature, Verdict, and Wolf's Gravestone. For 4-star weapons, as always for Claymore DPSs, Serpent Spine seems to be the best. And for free-to-play options, you can use either the Fontaine Craftable, assuming you have a healer on the team, and the Natlan Craftable. For artifact builds, as an off-field support, 4-piece Scroll is the obvious choice here. She doesn't benefit from the 2-piece, but the 4-piece team damage buff is always strong. With all other Natlan supports using this set, however, you may need to find alternative choices. Thus, Tenacity at the Melolith works as well, though you'll likely keep Mavuika unscroll on most of her teams. For a main DPS Mavuika, Obsidian Codex is still likely the best option. Even though Mavuika's primary attacks after being enhanced with her burst don't consume Night Soul points for 7 seconds, as long as you tap skill before using her burst, Night Soul points should be consumed before her burst puts Mavuika on her motorcycle form. So there will be 1 to 2 seconds of downtime on the 4-piece, so it is scuffed, but it's still potentially her best main DPS set. Otherwise, you can consider Maotrice Hunter with Farina or Crimson Witch. For artifact stats, Attack Hourglass, Pyro Goblet, Crit Circlet. Substats prioritize crit, then attack, then EM for main DPS if your team can take advantage of it. Remember that Mavuika uses Fighting Spirit instead of normal energy to charge her burst, so energy recharge is a completely useless stat on her. Lastly, let's cover Mavuika's potential team comps. First, let's cover her ability to be the primary source of off-field pyro application for teams in comparison with the best option that we've had since day one, Xiangling. Mavuika applies pyro off-field every 2 seconds. This is not as much pyro as what Xiangling can provide with Pyro NATO. However, in many teams that need off-field pyro application, they don't need that much pyro. Thus, Mavuika's current pyro application is perfectly fine. As a result, Mavuika can serve as a Xiangling replacement on top of bringing buffs from 4-piece Scroll and her elemental burst. In terms of her burst, ideally you have plenty of Fighting Spirit stacks so you can actually use it and maximize the buff that it provides. Consequently, Mavuika will work best with other Natlan characters or ones that normal attack a lot. For example, both Chaska and Kenich will get buffed by slotting in Mavuika. Kenich especially, as he finally gets a 4-piece Scroll holder for his teams. Molani teams also get a buff, but Mavuika works in specifically teams that don't have a second Hydro character that applies a lot of Hydro. In these teams, such as with Farina and Yelan, it is very likely that Mavuika's pyro application alone is not enough for consistent Molani vape, so Xiangling should still be used. For non-Natlan DPSs, Cloran is a big winner in Chevre's Overload teams. Even without a Natlan character, Cloran is still able to generate a good amount of stacks as she is a normal attack carry, and Mavuika will be better than Toma and potentially even Bennett as the pyro slot. Navia also benefits a lot from Mavuika, especially with Xilonen. In this team, Mavuika should deal similar damage to Xiangling on top of bringing in more buffs, and you can even choose to on-field her for a little bit after using her burst over normal attacking on Navia. You'll want to keep 4-piece Scroll on Xilonen here though. Lastly, Wriothesley kinda benefits from Mavuika when paired with Emily and potentially Xilonen. However, when concerning a team like Vape Melt, then it is unlikely that Mavuika has enough pyro application and that Xiangling is needed. In terms of main DPS Mavuika, Fighting Spirit stack generation is even more important as her burst brings a huge damage buff to her on-field attacks for 7 seconds. Thus, Natlan teammates are pretty much a must for main DPS teams, and the best one for this is Xilonen. Because Xilonen's kit results in her gaining 90 Night Soul points, then instantly consuming them all to activate her Res Shred, she effectively fills Mavuika's burst gauge by half of her maximum limit all by herself in about 2 seconds. Other Natlan characters can only generate a similar number of stacks after going through a whole rotation. Thus, Xilonen will be the safest option to allow Mavuika's main DPS teams to function. Example teams include Double Hydro with Farina Yelan, Farina Bennett, or Melt and Vape Melt teams with Sitlali, who is a new Melt enabler. For non-Xilonen teams, there is potential for Melt with just Sitlali and Chevre's Overload with Auroron, but do keep in mind that stack generation will be limited in these teams, so there is a chance that they don't work well, especially if you assume that you start a rotation with Mavuika's burst not being up. And that's everything on Mavuika as of now. Currently, there is some skepticism about her strength as an Archon due to many factors such as her off-field capabilities compared to Xiangling and team restrictions with her elemental burst. On top of that, we don't have new artifact sets coming this patch, which makes gearing Mavuika kind of awkward. But I think despite these potential flaws, Mavuika still looks extremely strong. In terms of off-field capabilities, it's true that Mavuika's initial beta kit does put less focus on her off-field role, as a lot of her buffs are for her main DPS role. But even so, Mavuika is still better than Xiangling in a lot of teams where Xiangling is brought primarily for her off-field pyro application, just not all of them. In these teams, Xiangling doesn't actually deal that much damage, and she really is kind of a bad performer in these teams, but she was only considered good because there was no better option for a pyro applicator. So even though Mavika's off-field kit isn't too overloaded, her personal damage is still comparable or better than Xiangling in these teams. But on top of that, she brings buffs from 4P scroll and a burst, and her application just requires a skill usage, so no 300 energy recharge needed. She doesn't completely replace Xiangling, as teams like Wriothesley Vade Melt, Ganyu Melt, and Malani Double Hydro ideally need Xiangling to function. But I think all of us just wanted another good off-field pyro applicator option, and Mavuika does fulfill that role as a Xiangling alternative or upgrade, both in terms of damage and quality of life. Now for main DPS Mavuika, current calcs show her best teams to be dealing similar damage to top DPSs like Kanich, Malani, and even Arlecchino. And Mavuika has the benefit of getting resistance to interruption and has massive AoE on her attacks. Unfortunately, Mavuika's best main DPS teams have to have natlan teammates like Xiangling, so her burst can actually give the damage buffs she needs to deal massive damage. And this fighting spirit mechanic to charge a burst favoring other natlan characters is a significant restriction to her team building that makes her more niche. But although her current kit isn't going to be as universal as an Archon like Farina, I think that like Nahida, who is extremely strong in her Dendro niche, Mavuika shines very well in her Night Soul niche, and that isn't a bad thing. And lastly, but most importantly to note, this is only the initial beta kit, so there is plenty of room for kit changes. But as of currently, Mavuika already looks to be a solid Archon that's both a top tier off-field support and a top tier main DPS. I hope this initial overview and analysis on Mavuika's kit was helpful to you. I'm super excited for Mavuika and will continue to follow her beta updates, so if you want to keep updated, sub to the channel for future news and analysis for the patch 5.3 characters. I also have a small Discord server, so if you want to discuss more about Mavuika, feel free to join and chill. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.